Blood-red dust kicked up beneath the auctioneer's boots as he paced across the platform, his voice booming over the crowd gathered in Shoshone, Idaho's town square on that sweltering July afternoon in 1876. "What am I bid for this fine specimen? Young, healthy, and strong enough for any man's needs." The auctioneer's calloused fingers wrapped around Penelope Blackwell's chin, forcing her face upward as tears streamed silently down her dirt-smudged cheeks. Penelope had never imagined ending up on an auction block. Just 3 weeks earlier, she had been traveling west with her elderly uncle, their wagon packed with everything they owned. When outlaws ambushed them near the Snake River, her uncle fell with a bullet in his chest. The bandits took everything including her freedom. Now, she stood trembling in a tattered dress, her auburn hair falling in tangled waves around her shoulders as strange men bid for her like cattle. $20, shouted a grizzled miner with tobacco-stained teeth. 30, countered a portly saloon owner whose eyes lingered on Penelope's figure with undisguised lust. $50 for the girl, called out a third man, a cattle baron known for his cruelty to both animals and people. The crowd jeered and laughed as each bid was placed. Some men made crude gestures. Women in the crowd either looked away in silent shame or watched with cold indifference. This was the harsh reality of frontier justice. A woman without protection became property to be claimed. "Look at this one, gentlemen. Hair like fire and spirit to match." The auctioneer yanked Penelope's arm, spinning her around for the crowd's inspection. "Who'll give me 60, 65, shouted the cattle baron, licking his lips. Penelope closed her eyes, praying for divine intervention or the sweet release of death. Either would be preferable to what awaited her. $100. A hush fell over the crowd. The voice was calm but carried such authority that heads turned immediately. The sea of people parted as a tall figure strode forward. Dust swirled around polished boot heels as the stranger approached the auction block with deliberate steps. Ethan Sawyer stood 6 feet tall, his broad shoulders accentuated by a well-worn leather vest over a clean white shirt. His dark hair was trimmed neatly beneath a black Stetson, and his face, though weathered by sun and wind, couldn't hide the fact that he was younger than most of the men present, perhaps 30 at most. A silver star pinned to his vest caught the sunlight. $100, he repeated, his blue eyes fixed on the auctioneer rather than the woman. "Though I should remind everyone that selling human beings became illegal some years ago." The auctioneer's face reddened. "Now see here, Marshal, this ain't no slave auction. This here's a criminal. What crime has she been charged with?" Ethan's voice remained even, but his hand rested casually near the Colt revolver on his hip. The auctioneer sputtered. "Well, she was caught with them outlaws. Being a victim isn't a crime." The marshal climbed the steps to the platform with measured strides. Standing eye to eye with the auctioneer, he continued, "And if someone wanted to charge her properly, they should have brought her to me." He turned to face the crowd. "As the only law in Shoshone, I'm declaring this auction over." The cattle baron stepped forward, his hand on his gun. "Now wait just a minute, Sawyer. We've got a tradition here. Traditions change," Ethan replied coolly. "And I suggest you remove your hand from that weapon unless you're eager to test how fast I can draw." A tense silence hung in the air. Penelope held her breath, watching the standoff with wide eyes. The baron slowly moved his hand away from his gun, but his face twisted with rage. "You can't just, she belongs to me." Ethan's words were simple but carried the weight of law. He reached into his pocket and tossed a small leather pouch to the auctioneer. Gold coins clinked inside. $100, more than fair for settling any alleged debts she might have incurred. He turned to Penelope then, his expression softening slightly as he offered his hand. Come along, miss. You're under my protection now. Penelope stared at the outstretched hand, uncertainty warring with desperate hope in her eyes. Was this truly a rescue or merely a change in ownership? With no better options, she placed her trembling fingers in his calloused palm. As Ethan helped her down from the platform, the crowd began to disperse, muttering their disappointment or relief depending on their nature. The marshal kept a firm but gentle grip on Penelope's elbow, guiding her away from the square toward the modest building that served as both jailhouse and marshal's office. "I don't know how to thank you," Penelope whispered, her voice hoarse from days of crying and little water. "Don't thank me yet," Ethan replied, his eyes scanning the dispersing crowd for signs of trouble. "We've still got to get you somewhere safe." The marshal's office was sparsely furnished: a desk, a few chairs, a gun rack, and 2 small cells in the back. Ethan led Penelope to a chair and filled a tin cup with water from a pitcher. "Drink slowly," he advised, handing her the cup before moving to the window to draw the curtains. Penelope sipped the water, relishing the cool liquid on her parched throat. "Are you really the marshal here?" Ethan nodded, removing his hat and placing it on the desk. "For about 2 years now." "And did you mean what you said out there, about me being under your protection?" "I did." He leaned against the desk, studying her. "But I should be clear, I didn't buy you. That money was to shut them up and give us a clean exit. You're not property, miss. Blackwell, Penelope Blackwell." She lowered the cup to her lap. "My uncle and I were traveling to Oregon when we were attacked. He was killed, and the outlaws took me with them. I escaped near town, but someone caught me and assumed I was with them willingly." Ethan's jaw tightened. "The Dalton gang, most likely. They've been terrorizing travelers along the Snake River for months." "What happens to me now?" Penelope asked, unable to keep the fear from her voice. "That depends." Ethan folded his arms across his chest. "Do you have any family or friends you can go to?" Penelope shook her head, fresh tears threatening to spill. "No one. My parents died of fever 3 years ago. Uncle William was my only family, and we sold everything to start fresh in Oregon." Ethan rubbed his jaw thoughtfully. "There's a widow who runs a boarding house on the edge of town, Mrs. Sullivan. She's a good woman who might take you in, at least temporarily." "I have no money," Penelope admitted. "Everything was in our wagon. I'll speak with her." Ethan straightened up and reached for his hat. "For now, you should rest here. There's a cot in the back room I use sometimes during long shifts. You'll be safe." As he turned to leave, Penelope caught his sleeve. "Marshal Sawyer, why did you help me? You didn't know me or my situation." Ethan paused, his blue eyes meeting her green ones. "Because it was the right thing to do." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "And because I've seen too many good people chewed up by the territories. This land's harsh enough without men making it worse." With that, he settled his hat on his head and stepped out, leaving Penelope alone with her thoughts and the first sense of security she'd felt in weeks. Ethan returned 2 hours later with a small bundle under his arm. He found Penelope asleep on the cot, her face finally peaceful in slumber. Not wanting to disturb her, he placed the package containing a simple dress, a hairbrush, and other necessities Mrs. Sullivan had donated on the desk, and quietly began sorting through wanted posters. When Penelope finally stirred and emerged from the back room, the afternoon sun was casting long shadows through the windows. She stopped short when she saw Ethan at his desk. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to sleep so long," she said, smoothing her tangled hair self-consciously. Ethan looked up from his paperwork. "You needed the rest. There's a package for you. There's some clean clothes and things. And there's a washroom through that door if you'd like to clean up." Penelope's eyes widened at the unexpected kindness. "Thank you," she whispered, gathering the bundle and disappearing into the small washroom. When she emerged half an hour later, the transformation was striking. Her auburn hair fell in damp waves down her back, and the simple blue calico dress, while a bit large for her frame, was clean and whole. She'd washed the dirt from her face, revealing a light dusting of freckles across her nose and cheeks. "That's better," Ethan said, standing as she entered. "Mrs. Sullivan has agreed to take you in. She can always use help with the boarders, and she's willing to provide room and board in exchange for your assistance." Relief washed over Penelope's face. "That's more than fair. I'm not afraid of hard work." "I don't doubt it." Ethan gathered his hat. "I'll take you there now, while the streets are quiet." As they walked through town, Penelope kept close to Ethan's side, acutely aware of the curious glances from townspeople. News traveled fast in small places like Shoshone. "They'll forget about you in a week," Ethan assured her, noticing her discomfort. "Some other scandal will take your place." "Is that what I am, a scandal?" There was a hint of bitterness in her voice. "No," Ethan replied firmly. "You're a survivor." "But people here have little to occupy them besides gossip." They reached a 2-story white clapboard house at the edge of town. A neat garden surrounded the porch, where an older woman sat in a rocking chair, shelling peas into a bowl. Martha Sullivan was in her 60s, her gray hair pulled back in a tidy bun. Her face, though lined with age, was kind, and her blue eyes sharp with intelligence. She stood as they approached. "So this is the young lady, Mrs. Sullivan said, looking Penelope over with an appraising but not unkind gaze. "Welcome to my home, child. I understand you've had quite an ordeal." "Yes, madam," Penelope replied softly, "and I'm very grateful for your kindness in taking me in." "Well, don't thank me yet. I work my help hard." The older woman's eyes twinkled. "But I feed them well and make sure they have comfortable beds." "I'll leave you ladies to get acquainted," Ethan said, tipping his hat. "Miss Blackwell, if you need anything, you know where to find me." As he turned to leave, Mrs. Sullivan called after him, "You'll join us for Sunday dinner, Marshal. I'm making my apple pie." A small smile crossed Ethan's face. "I wouldn't miss it, Mrs. Sullivan." Penelope watched him walk away, a strange flutter in her chest. She barely knew this man who had stepped into her life so dramatically, yet she felt oddly bereft watching him go. "He's a good man," Mrs. Sullivan said, reading Penelope's expression. "One of the few truly honorable ones left out here. Now come along inside, and I'll show you your duties and your room." The boarding house was neat and well-maintained, with 6 guest rooms upstairs, and Mrs. Sullivan's quarters and common areas downstairs. Penelope would be responsible for cleaning the rooms, helping with laundry, and assisting with meal preparation for the boarders, currently 3 single men who worked at the bank or general store, and a schoolteacher. Her own room was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a small chest of drawers. It was the first private space she'd had in weeks, and Penelope could have wept with gratitude. "Rest tonight," Mrs. Sullivan instructed. "Tomorrow we begin early." True to her word, Mrs. Sullivan woke Penelope before dawn the next day. The work was hard but honest, and Penelope threw herself into it, grateful for the distraction from her grief and trauma. Days passed in a blur of cleaning, cooking, and learning the rhythms of the boarding house. The boarders were mostly respectful, though Mr. Phillips from the bank watched her a little too closely for comfort. Mrs. Sullivan, however, ran a tight ship and tolerated no impropriety under her roof. "The girl's been through enough," Penelope overheard her telling Mr. Phillips one evening when he tried to engage her in conversation for too long. "You'll treat her with respect or find other lodgings." Sunday came, and with it, the promised dinner. Penelope spent extra time with her appearance, pinning her hair more carefully and wearing the nicer of the 2 dresses Mrs. Sullivan had given her. "You look lovely, dear," the older woman commented as they prepared the meal. "The blue brings out your eyes." Penelope blushed. "Thank you. I just wanted to look presentable for company." Mrs. Sullivan's knowing smile suggested she wasn't fooled. "He usually arrives precisely at noon." Right on time, Ethan's knock sounded at the door. He stood on the porch with his hat in his hands, wearing a clean shirt and his best vest. He'd even trimmed his beard, Penelope noticed. "Ladies," he greeted them, presenting Mrs. Sullivan with a small package of store-bought candies and nodding politely to Penelope. Dinner was pleasant with Mrs. Sullivan carrying most of the conversation, sharing town gossip and stories from her long life on the frontier. Penelope spoke little, but she observed Ethan closely when he wasn't looking her way. There was a quietness to him that intrigued her, not shyness, but a thoughtful reserve. After the meal, while Mrs. Sullivan fetched her famous apple pie, Ethan and Penelope found themselves momentarily alone in the parlor. "How are you settling in?" he asked, his deep voice softened for privacy. "Well enough," Penelope replied. "Mrs. Sullivan is stern but fair. The work is hard, but—" She hesitated. "It feels good to be useful again." Ethan nodded. "You're safe here, that's what matters. Because I belong to you now." The words slipped out before she could stop them, a hint of challenge in her tone. Ethan's gaze sharpened. "Is that what you think?" Penelope looked down at her hands. "That's what you said, at the auction." "I said what I needed to say to get you out of there." His voice was firm but not unkind. "You don't belong to anyone, Miss Blackwell. Not me, not this town, not the men who tried to sell you." Before she could respond, Mrs. Sullivan returned with the pie, and the moment passed. But something had shifted between them, a clarity, perhaps, or the beginning of understanding. As weeks turned into a month, Penelope established a routine at the boarding house. She rose early, prepared breakfast for the boarders, cleaned the rooms, helped with lunch, did the washing, and assisted with dinner. In her rare free moments, she sat on the back porch with a book borrowed from Mrs. Sullivan's modest library. Ethan began stopping by the boarding house more frequently, sometimes just for coffee, other times staying for a meal. His visits were ostensibly to check on Penelope's well-being, but Mrs. Sullivan's knowing glances suggested she suspected other motivations. On one such visit in late August, Ethan found Penelope alone on the back porch, shelling peas into a bowl. "Mrs. Sullivan gone to her sister's?" he asked, leaning against the porch rail. Penelope nodded. "Until tomorrow. The boarders are all at work, so I'm catching up on some tasks." Ethan seemed uncharacteristically hesitant. "I was wondering if you might like to walk with me. There's something I'd like to show you." Curious, Penelope set aside her work. "Let me just change my apron." They walked through town and beyond, following a dirt path that led toward the Snake River. The summer heat had begun to wane, and a pleasant breeze rustled the tall grass around them. Ethan maintained a respectful distance, but stayed close enough to converse. "How much do you remember about the day you were taken?" he asked after they'd walked in comfortable silence for a while. Penelope tensed slightly. "Enough. Why? I've been tracking the Dalton gang for weeks. Got reports they've moved back into the area." His expression was grave. "I thought you should know." Fear flickered across Penelope's face. "Do you think they'd come for me?" "No," Ethan was quick to reassure her. "They have no idea where you are, and even if they did, they wouldn't dare come into town. But—" he hesitated. "What?" Penelope pressed. "I might need your help identifying them if they're captured." His eyes met hers. "I wouldn't ask if it wasn't important." Penelope swallowed hard. "Of course. If it helps catch them, I'll do whatever's needed." They reached a bend in the river where a cluster of cottonwood trees provided shade. Ethan led her to a fallen log where they could sit and watch the water flow past. "This is what I wanted to show you," he said, gesturing to the peaceful scene. "I come here sometimes when the job gets heavy. Thought you might appreciate a moment away from the boarding house." Penelope took in the beauty of the place, the clear water, the rustling leaves, the distant mountains. "It's lovely," she said softly. "Thank you for sharing it." They sat in companionable silence for a while until Ethan spoke again. "Mrs. Sullivan says you're a hard worker, the best help she's had in years." A small smile curved Penelope's lips. "She's generous with her praise, then." "I'm still learning." "She also says you cry in your sleep sometimes." Penelope's smile faded. "I didn't realize she could hear that." Ethan turned slightly to face her. "Nightmares. Memories, mostly." Penelope watched a dragonfly skim across the water's surface. "My uncle dying." "The days after with the gang. Did they hurt you?" The question was gentle but direct. Penelope closed her eyes briefly. "Not in the way you're asking. The leader, Dalton, said I was merchandise to be delivered undamaged to a buyer in Montana. He kept the others away from me." She shuddered. "Small mercies, I suppose." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Human trafficking. It's becoming more common in the territories." His hand formed a fist on his knee. "I'll find them, Penelope. You have my word." It was the first time he'd used her given name, and the intimacy of it hung in the air between them. "I believe you," she said simply, "but please be careful. They're dangerous men. So am I when I need to be." There was no boast in his words, just a simple statement of fact. Penelope studied his profile, the straight nose, the firm jaw, the eyes that had seen more than their share of frontier justice. "I'm beginning to see that." As they walked back to town, their hands brushed accidentally, sending an unexpected warmth through Penelope's arm. She pulled away quickly, embarrassed by her reaction. "I'm sorry," Ethan said, misinterpreting her movement. "I didn't mean to overstep." "You didn't," Penelope assured him. "It's just been a long time since I felt safe enough to be near anyone." Understanding dawned in Ethan's eyes. "Time heals, Penelope. Not completely, perhaps, but enough." When they reached the boarding house, Ethan tipped his hat in farewell. "Sunday dinner again," Penelope nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. "Mrs. Sullivan would be disappointed if you didn't come." "Just Mrs. Sullivan." A rare, teasing note entered his voice. Penelope felt a blush warm her cheeks. "I might miss your company as well, Marshal Sawyer." "Ethan," he corrected gently. "When we're not in official capacity, I'd be honored if you'd call me Ethan." "Ethan," she repeated softly, testing the name. "Until Sunday, then." He watched her enter the house before turning away, unaware that she observed him through the lace curtains until he disappeared around the corner. September brought cooler temperatures and the first hints of autumn to Shoshone. Penelope settled more comfortably into her role at the boarding house, and the townspeople gradually accepted her presence. Some even nodded politely when they passed her on the street, a marked improvement from the suspicious glances of her early days. Ethan's visits became a regular occurrence, sometimes on official business, checking in with Mrs. Sullivan about new arrivals in town, but often just for coffee or conversation. Penelope found herself looking forward to these visits, planning her chores so she would be free when he typically stopped by. Mrs. Sullivan watched this developing attachment with a mixture of approval and concern. One afternoon, as they kneaded bread dough side by side, she broached the subject. "The marshal seems to have taken quite an interest in your welfare," she observed casually. Penelope concentrated on the dough beneath her hands. "He's kind to everyone. Not like this child." Mrs. Sullivan's experienced fingers shaped perfect loaves. "I've known Ethan Sawyer since he came to Shoshone. He's a good man but a private one. Doesn't let many people close." Penelope said nothing, but her cheeks colored slightly. "Just be careful with your heart," the older woman continued gently. "Being a lawman's wife isn't easy, especially out here. Mrs. Sullivan, Penelope exclaimed, flustered. The marshal and I are merely acquaintances. The widow's knowing smile suggested she thought otherwise. If you say so, dear. Just remember that life moves differently on the frontier, sometimes faster than you expect. Before Penelope could respond, a commotion erupted outside, horses galloping, men shouting. They hurried to the window to see Ethan and his deputy riding hard down the main street, revolvers drawn. Trouble, Mrs. Sullivan murmured, wiping her hands on her apron. Minutes later, gunshots echoed from the direction of the bank. Penelope's heart leapt into her throat. Without thinking, she ran to the door, but Mrs. Sullivan caught her arm. "Stay inside." The older woman commanded. "That's no place for you." "But Ethan is doing his job, Mrs. Sullivan finished firmly. "And he'll do it better knowing you're safe." They waited in tense silence, straining to hear any news. After what seemed like hours but was likely only 20 minutes, a neighbor boy came running with word that the marshal had stopped a bank robbery. 3 men from the Dalton gang had been captured, but 2 had escaped. The deputy had taken a bullet in the shoulder. "And the marshal?" Penelope asked urgently. "He's fine, madam," the boy reported. "Got himself a cut on his head, but he's taking the prisoners to the jail now." Relief flooded through Penelope, followed quickly by dread. If members of the Dalton gang were in custody, Ethan would soon call upon her to identify them. Sure enough, as evening fell, Ethan appeared at the boarding house door. A bandage was wrapped around his head, and dried blood stained his shirt collar. He looked exhausted but determined. "Miss Blackwell," he said formally, aware of Mrs. Sullivan hovering nearby. "I need to ask for your assistance at the jailhouse if you're willing." Penelope nodded, reaching for her shawl. "Of course." Mrs. Sullivan touched her arm. "You don't have to do this, child." "Yes, I do," Penelope replied quietly, "for my uncle if nothing else." The walk to the jailhouse was tense. Ethan stayed close to Penelope, his hand occasionally brushing the small of her back protectively as they navigated the crowded sidewalk. News of the attempted robbery had brought curious onlookers into the streets. "You're sure you're up to this?" Ethan asked as they approached the marshal's office. "They're secure in the cells. They can't hurt you." Penelope squared her shoulders. "I'm sure." Inside, Deputy Morgan sat at the desk, his arm in a sling. 3 men occupied the 2 cells, 2 in one, 1 in the other. They looked up as Penelope entered, and recognition flashed across their faces. "Well, well," drawled the largest man, a burly figure with a thick beard. "Look who it is, the little bird who flew the coop." Ethan's hand moved to his gun. "Watch your mouth, Dalton." Cold fear washed over Penelope as she stared at the leader of the gang. Memories flooded back, his rough hands forcing her into the wagon, his threats when she tried to escape, his calculating eyes as he discussed her value with his men. "That's him," she said, her voice remarkably steady. "That's Nathan Dalton, the leader." Ethan nodded, then gestured to the other men. "And these 2, Penelope studied them carefully. The one with the scar was called Myers. He was Dalton's right hand. She pointed to the 3rd man, younger than the others. "I don't recognize him. He might have joined after I escaped." "Thank you," Ethan said quietly. "That's all we needed." As they turned to leave, Dalton called after them, "This ain't over, Marshal. My brother's still out there, and he knows about your pretty little friend." Ethan's face hardened. "Let's go," he murmured to Penelope, guiding her outside. Once they were back on the street, Penelope released a shaky breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "What happens now?" "The circuit judge arrives next week. They'll be tried for robbery, murder, and kidnapping." Ethan's expression was grim. "With your testimony, they'll hang." Penelope wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the mild evening. "And the ones who escaped, will find them." His tone left no room for doubt. "But until then, I want you to be extra careful." Don't go anywhere alone, even in town." They walked in silence for a moment before Ethan spoke again, his voice softer. "You were brave in there, Penelope." "I didn't feel brave," she admitted. "I felt terrified. Courage isn't the absence of fear, it's acting despite it." He stopped walking and turned to face her. "And you have more courage than most men I know." Something in his gaze made her heart beat faster. For a moment, she thought he might touch her face or take her hand, but instead, he cleared his throat and resumed walking. "I'll see you safely back to Mrs. Sullivan's," he said, his professional manner returning. But something had changed between them, a boundary crossed, perhaps, or a truth acknowledged. As Penelope watched him walk away after delivering her to the boarding house door, she recognized the feeling unfurling in her chest for what it was. The beginning of love. The week that followed was tense for the entire town of Shoshone. With 2 members of the Dalton gang still at large, Ethan doubled the night patrols and advised businesses to take extra precautions. For Penelope, it meant virtual confinement to the boarding house, except when accompanied by Mrs. Sullivan or one of the trusted boarders. Despite the restrictions, Ethan found reasons to visit daily, bringing news, checking windows and doors, or simply sharing coffee before continuing his rounds. These brief moments became the highlight of Penelope's days, and she found herself taking extra care with her appearance, even if just to serve him coffee in the kitchen. On the morning the circuit judge was due to arrive, Penelope was helping Mrs. Sullivan prepare rooms for the additional visitors the trial would bring to town when a knock came at the door. Expecting Ethan, she hurried to answer it, smoothing her apron self-consciously. Instead, she found a stranger, a well-dressed man in his 40s with a trimmed mustache and expensive boots. He removed his hat with a flourish. "Good morning," he said smoothly. "I'm looking for Miss Penelope Blackwell." Penelope hesitated, instinctively wary. "May I ask who's calling?" "Forgive my manners. Harold Stanford at your service." He offered a business card. "I represent the California Mining Consortium. I understand you recently lost your uncle, William Blackwell." Surprise registered on Penelope's face. "Yes, but how did you— business records, my dear." Stanford smiled, revealing gold teeth. "Your uncle was in negotiations with our company before his unfortunate demise. He owned a claim in the Boys Basin that interested us greatly." Mrs. Sullivan appeared behind Penelope. "What's this about?" Stanford repeated his introduction, adding, "I've come to settle the business with Miss Blackwell as William's heir. The claim is quite valuable. Our company is prepared to offer $5,000. Penelope's mind reeled. Uncle William had never mentioned a mining claim, but then again, they'd had little time for conversation during their journey west. "I don't understand," she said slowly. "I never heard about any claim." "Perfectly understandable," Stanford nodded sympathetically. "Many prospectors keep their findings quiet, but I have the paperwork here." He patted his breast pocket. "All that's needed is your signature to complete the sale." Mrs. Sullivan narrowed her eyes. "Perhaps you should discuss this with Marshal Sawyer present, Penelope." Stanford's smile faltered slightly. "That's hardly necessary for a simple business transaction." "I insist," Penelope said firmly, finding her voice. "If this claim truly belonged to my uncle, I want to make sure everything is handled properly. The marshal can advise me." "Very well," Stanford conceded, replacing his hat. "I'm staying at the hotel. Perhaps we could meet at the marshal's office this afternoon." After he left, Mrs. Sullivan squeezed Penelope's hand. "Smart girl. Never trust a man with gold teeth who comes bearing unexpected fortunes." Ethan's reaction to Stanford's visit was immediate suspicion. "The timing is too convenient," he said, pacing his office while Penelope sat in the chair across from his desk. "Right when the Dalton gang is captured, A stranger appears offering money for a claim you never knew existed. You think it's connected? Penelope asked. I don't believe in coincidences. Ethan stopped pacing. Did your uncle ever mention prospecting or owning a claim? Penelope shook her head. Never. He was a carpenter by trade. We were going to Oregon to open a furniture shop. Then something's not right. Ethan frowned thoughtfully. I'll send a telegram to the mining office in Boise, see if they have any record of a claim in your uncle's name. He checked his pocket watch. Stanford should be here soon. Let me do the talking. When Stanford arrived, he brought a leather portfolio filled with documents. Ah, Marshal Sawyer, he greeted, offering his hand. A pleasure to meet the law in Shoshone. Ethan shook his hand briefly. Mr. Stanford, I understand you're interested in purchasing a mining claim from Miss Blackwell. Indeed. Stanford pulled out several papers. As you can see, William Blackwell registered this claim in the Boise Basin 8 months ago. Initial assays suggest a rich vein of silver, potentially worth much more than our offer, but given the investment required to extract it properly. Ethan examined the documents carefully. These appear to be in order, he admitted reluctantly. But I'm curious why your consortium waited until now to pursue this purchase. Stanford smiled smoothly. We only recently received confirmation of the assay results. Mining is a careful business, Marshal. We don't rush into investments. And how did you know to find Miss Blackwell in Shoshone? A flicker of something annoyance perhaps crossed Stanford's face before his smile returned. We have agents throughout the territories tracking potential acquisitions. Word reached us of Mr. Blackwell's tragic demise and his niece's situation. Penelope tensed at the implication that her ordeal was common knowledge. I'll need time to verify these documents, Ethan said firmly. And Miss Blackwell will need to consult with a lawyer before signing anything. Stanford's smile tightened. Of course. But I should mention that our offer is time-sensitive. The consortium's board meets in San Francisco next week to finalize investments for the coming year. Then, they'll need to be patient, Ethan replied coolly. Miss Blackwell won't be rushed into decisions about her inheritance. After Stanford left, promising to return in 2 days, Penelope let out a long breath. Do you think the claim is real? The documents look authentic, Ethan admitted, but something feels wrong. I'll have answers once I hear back from Boise. He gave her a reassuring smile. Don't worry. Whatever this is, we'll figure it out together. The word together lingered in the air between them, weighted with unspoken meaning. The next day brought the circuit judge to Shoshone, and with him, the formal proceedings against the captured members of the Dalton gang. Penelope provided her testimony in the crowded courtroom, her voice steady as she recounted her uncle's murder and her subsequent kidnapping. Ethan sat nearby, his supportive presence giving her strength. The judge wasted little time delivering his verdict, guilty on all counts with sentencing scheduled for the following morning. As Ethan escorted Penelope from the courthouse, Stanford approached them on the street, his expression troubled. Miss Blackwell, Marshal, he greeted them hurriedly. I've just received a telegram from my superiors. They're growing concerned about the delay. I'm authorized to increase our offer to $6,000 if we can conclude our business tomorrow. Before either could respond, a messenger boy ran up to Ethan, handing him a telegram. The marshal read it quickly, his expression hardening. Thank you, he told the boy, pressing a coin into his hand. Then, turning to Stanford, his voice took on a dangerous edge. Mr. Stanford, I'd like you to come to my office. Now. Stanford paled slightly. Is something wrong? We'll discuss it privately. Ethan's hand moved subtly toward his gun. Miss Blackwell, please return to the boarding house. I'll call on you later. Confused and concerned, Penelope did as asked. She spent the afternoon in anxious anticipation, jumping at every sound that might signal Ethan's arrival. Finally, as evening approached, he appeared at the boarding house, his expression grim but satisfied. Mrs. Sullivan tactfully left them alone in the parlor, though she kept the door ajar for propriety's sake. "Stanford is in my jail," Ethan announced without preamble. "His real name is Howard Simmons, and he's wanted in 3 states for fraud." Penelope gasped. "The mining claim." "Completely fabricated. The documents were excellent forgeries, but there's no record of your uncle ever filing a claim." Ethan sat beside her on the settee. "But here's where it gets interesting. Simmons is connected to the Dalton gang. He specializes in land fraud, and they provide muscle when victims resist." "So it was a trap," Penelope whispered, realization dawning. "They were using me to lure you in." Ethan nodded grimly. "If you'd agreed to meet him alone to sign the papers, you would have disappeared. And if I'd accompanied you without backup." He didn't need to finish the thought. "The remaining gang members, they're still out there, aren't they?" Fear crept into Penelope's voice. "Yes, but they're running now." Ethan's hand covered hers, warm and reassuring. "Simmons confessed everything once he realized the game was up. He's given us information on their hideout. A posse is forming tonight." Penelope turned her hand to clasp his. "You're going after them?" It wasn't a question, but Ethan answered anyway. "I have to. They won't stop otherwise." "When do you leave?" "Dawn." His thumb traced small circles on her palm, the intimate gesture at odds with the gravity of their conversation. "I wanted you to know before I go, and to ask you to stay with Mrs. Sullivan. Don't leave the house for any reason until I return." Penelope looked down at their joined hands. "How long will you be gone?" 3 days, maybe 4. Depends on how far they've run." He hesitated, then added softly, "I'll come back, Penelope." She raised her eyes to his. "Promise me." "I promise." His gaze dropped to her lips for the briefest moment before he caught himself and stood. "I should go. There are preparations to make." Penelope rose as well, still holding his hand. "Ethan." Whatever she might have said was interrupted by Mrs. Sullivan bustling in with a tea tray. "I thought you might like some refreshment," she announced, then paused, noticing their clasped hands and the intensity in their expressions. "Or perhaps I'm intruding." "Not at all," Ethan said, reluctantly releasing Penelope's hand. "I was just leaving. Thank you for the tea, Mrs. Sullivan, but I have work to do." At the door, he turned back to Penelope. "Remember what I said. Stay inside." After he left, Mrs. Sullivan sat beside Penelope on the settee, pouring tea with a steady hand. "He's going after them, isn't he?" Penelope nodded, staring into her teacup. "That man's been alone too long," the widow observed quietly. "Makes him reckless sometimes." "What do you mean?" Penelope asked. Mrs. Sullivan stirred sugar into her tea. "When a man has nothing to lose, he takes risks he shouldn't, but when he has someone to come back for." She gave Penelope a significant look. "Well, that changes everything." Penelope blushed but didn't deny the implication. "Do you think he'll be safe?" "Ethan Sawyer is the most capable lawman I've seen in 30 years on the frontier," Mrs. Sullivan said confidently. "But it wouldn't hurt to pray for him, all the same." Dawn broke cold and misty as the posse gathered in front of the marshal's office. From her window at the boarding house, Penelope watched Ethan checking his saddle and firearms, his movements precise and efficient. 6 other men joined him, the deputy with his arm still in a sling, 2 ranchers, a blacksmith, and 2 young cowboys eager for adventure. Just before mounting up, Ethan looked toward the boarding house. Though he couldn't possibly see her through the curtains, Penelope raised her hand in a silent farewell. Then they were gone, hoofbeats fading as they rode east toward the mountains where the Dalton hideout was rumored to be. The 3 days that followed were the longest of Penelope's life. She threw herself into her duties at the boarding house, scrubbing floors that didn't need cleaning and baking enough bread to feed half the town. Mrs. Sullivan watched with knowing eyes but said nothing, finding extra tasks to keep Penelope's hands and mind occupied. On the evening of the third day, as hope began to fade, the sound of horses entering town set Penelope's heart racing. She ran to the window, straining to see in the gathering dusk. A group of riders approached, moving slowly. 2 horses carried bodies draped over their saddles, dead men, presumably the remaining Dalton gang members. But where was Ethan? Panic seized her as she counted the riders. 5, not 7. 2 men were missing. Unable to bear the uncertainty, Penelope grabbed her shawl and headed for the door. "Child, wait," Mrs. Sullivan called after her. "You promised." "I have to know," Penelope replied, her voice breaking. "I have to see if he's—" Before she could finish, the front door opened, revealing Ethan himself, hat in hand. His face was bruised, a fresh cut across his cheekbone adding to the one on his forehead, and exhaustion lined every feature. But he was alive. "Ethan!" Penelope cried, propriety forgotten as she rushed forward. He caught her in his arms, holding her tightly despite his obvious pain. "I promised I'd come back," he murmured into her hair. Mrs. Sullivan cleared her throat pointedly. "Marshal Sawyer, you look like you could use some hot food and coffee." Ethan released Penelope reluctantly, though he kept one hand lightly at the small of her back. "Thank you, Mrs. Sullivan." "That would be most welcome." Over a hearty meal of beef stew and fresh bread, Ethan recounted the posse's pursuit of the Dalton brothers. They'd tracked them to an abandoned mining cabin in the mountains, where a shootout ensued. "They wouldn't surrender," he explained, his voice heavy with the weight of necessary violence. "Thomas Reynolds, one of the ranchers, took a bullet in the leg. We left him at a homestead to recover before bringing him back to town." "And the Daltons?" Penelope asked quietly. "Dead." Ethan met her eyes across the table. "They won't hurt anyone else." After dinner, Mrs. Sullivan tactfully retired early, leaving Ethan and Penelope alone in the parlor with the door conspicuously open. They sat side by side on the settee, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. "What happens now?" Penelope asked, breaking the comfortable silence. "Simmons will stand trial with the other gang members. With their testimony, your uncle's killers will face justice." Ethan turned slightly to face her. "As for you, you're free to go wherever you choose. Start that new life you were heading for." Penelope studied his face, reading the question he wasn't asking. "And if I chose to stay in Shoshone?" "Then Mrs. Sullivan would be pleased to keep her best helper," he answered carefully. "Just Mrs. Sullivan." She echoed his words from weeks earlier, a small smile playing at her lips. Ethan's hand found hers, his calloused fingers entwining with her smaller ones. "No," he admitted softly, "not just Mrs. Sullivan." The kiss, when it came, was gentle, a question rather than a demand. Penelope answered by leaning into him, her free hand coming up to rest against his chest where she could feel his heart beating as rapidly as her own. When they parted, Ethan rested his forehead against hers. "I have nothing to offer but a lawman's life," he said roughly. "It's not easy or safe." "I don't need easy or safe," Penelope replied. "I just need you." The autumn days grew shorter as October painted the landscape in gold and crimson. Shoshone settled back into its normal rhythms after the excitement of the trial and hangings. For Penelope, however, life had changed irrevocably. Her courtship with Ethan progressed with frontier practicality, tempered by Mrs. Sullivan's insistence on propriety. They took Sunday walks along the river, shared meals at the boarding house, and occasionally rode to neighboring farms when Ethan's duties allowed. Each encounter deepened their understanding of one another, Penelope learning about the tragedy that had driven Ethan to become a lawman. and Ethan discovering the quiet strength that had helped Penelope survive her ordeal. On a crisp November evening, as they sat on the boarding house porch wrapped in blankets against the chill, Ethan broached the subject they'd both been considering. "Winter's coming," he observed, watching their breath fog in the cool air. "Makes a man think about having a proper home." Penelope smiled. "Does it now?" "It does." Ethan shifted to face her. "I've been saving for a piece of land just outside town. There's a small house on it, nothing fancy but solid. Could be made comfortable with the right touch." "It sounds lovely," Penelope said carefully, her heart beating faster. Ethan took her hand, his expression serious. "Penelope, I'm not a man of flowery words, but I know what I want, and that's a life with you." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a simple gold band. "Will you marry me?" Tears filled Penelope's eyes as she nodded. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will." The ring slid onto her finger, a perfect fit. "I had it made by Jenkins at the jewelry store," Ethan explained. "Had to guess at the size." "It's beautiful," Penelope assured him, admiring how the gold caught the lamplight from the window. Their wedding took place 2 weeks later in Shoshone's small church. The entire town attended, partly out of genuine goodwill, and partly out of curiosity about the unlikely romance between their stoic marshal and the woman he'd rescued from the auction block. Mrs. Sullivan had helped Penelope make a simple but elegant wedding dress from cream-colored fabric ordered specially from boys. Ethan wore a new black suit, looking somewhat uncomfortable in the formal attire, but handsome nonetheless. The deputy served as best man, and Mrs. Sullivan stood as Penelope's matron of honor. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, Ethan kissed his bride with restrained passion, mindful of their audience but unable to completely hide the depth of his feelings. The townspeople cheered as they walked back down the aisle, Penelope's arm linked through her husband's. The celebration continued at the boarding house, where Mrs. Sullivan had prepared a feast with help from several town ladies. As the evening progressed, Ethan and Penelope slipped away to the house that would now be their home. It was indeed small but solidly built, with 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, a parlor, and a covered porch. Ethan had spent the weeks of their engagement preparing it, fixing the roof, repairing floorboards, and even building a new kitchen table and chairs with his own hands. "Welcome home, Mrs. Sawyer," he said as he carried her across the threshold. In the privacy of their home, the restraint they'd maintained throughout their courtship finally gave way to the passion that had been building between them. Their first night together was a tender exploration of love and desire, each discovering the joy of complete surrender to the other. As they lay entwined in the darkness, Penelope traced the scars on Ethan's body, evidence of years enforcing the law in a violent territory. "Are you happy?" he asked softly, his hand smoothing her auburn hair across the pillow. "Happier than I ever thought possible," she replied, pressing a kiss to his chest. Winter arrived with a vengeance, bringing snow and biting winds that howled around the eaves of their small house. Ethan continued his duties as marshal, though he arranged for the deputy to take more responsibility so he could spend more time at home. Penelope created a warm, welcoming haven, applying the skills she'd learned at the boarding house to her own household. Mrs. Sullivan became a frequent visitor, bringing housewarmings, gifts, and advice for the newlyweds. "You've done well for yourself," she told Penelope one afternoon as they sat drinking tea in the cozy kitchen. "And he's a changed man since you came into his life." "Changed how?" Penelope asked curiously. "He smiles now," the older woman said simply, "and he takes fewer risks. A man with something to lose is more careful than one who's alone." As Christmas approached, Shoshone organized its annual celebration, a community dinner at the church, followed by caroling and gift exchanges. On Christmas Eve, after returning from the festivities, Ethan and Penelope sat before their fireplace, exchanging their private gifts. Penelope gave Ethan a hand-knitted scarf and a new holster she'd secretly commissioned from the town's leatherworker. He presented her with a silver hairbrush and mirror set he'd ordered from a catalog, and a small wooden box he'd made himself. "Open it," he urged when she admired the intricate carving on the lid. Inside was a deed, the official paperwork for their home and the surrounding 5 acres of land. "It's ours now, free and clear," Ethan explained. "No matter what happens, you'll always have a home." Penelope blinked back tears. "It's the most wonderful gift." Ethan took her hands in his. "I have something to tell you," he said, his expression serious. "The territorial governor has offered me a position as a federal marshal." Penelope's heart skipped a beat. "What does that mean?" "More responsibility, more travel." He squeezed her hands gently. "But also more pay and eventually a pension." "You want to take it?" Penelope observed, reading his expression. Ethan nodded. "I think I could do good work, help bring more law to the territories." He paused. "But I won't accept if you don't want me to. Your happiness comes first." Penelope considered his words carefully. "Would we have to leave Shoshone?" "No, not right away. This would be my base, but I'd have to ride circuit sometimes. Be gone for days, maybe weeks." The concern in his eyes was evident. "After everything you've been through, I wouldn't blame you for wanting stability." "Ethan," Penelope said softly, moving to kneel before him, "I married you knowing who you are and what you do. I'd never ask you to be less than the man I fell in love with." Relief washed over his face. "You're sure?" "I'm sure." She smiled, then added, "Besides, we should take the opportunity now before our family grows." It took a moment for her meaning to register. When it did, Ethan's eyes widened. "Are you saying?" Penelope nodded, her smile growing. "Dr. Morris confirmed it yesterday. We're going to have a baby sometime in early summer." Joy transformed Ethan's face as he pulled her into his arms. "A baby," he whispered in wonder. "Our baby." They celebrated their news privately that night, holding each other close as snow fell softly outside their windows. The future stretched before them, uncertain in some ways, but secure in the knowledge of their love for each other. Spring arrived, melting the snow and bringing new life to the land around Shoshone. Ethan had accepted the federal marshal position, and true to his word, he used their home as his base while traveling the territory as needed. When present, he continued to serve as Shoshone's local lawman, maintaining the peace in the growing community. Penelope's pregnancy progressed smoothly, her figure rounding as the baby grew within her. When Ethan was away, Mrs. Sullivan often stayed with her, providing companionship and practical support. The townspeople, once suspicious of the auctioned woman, now embraced her fully as their marshal's wife, bringing gifts for the coming baby and offering assistance whenever needed. In late June, as summer heat baked the land, Penelope went into labor. Ethan, who had been tracking cattle rustlers near the Oregon border, arrived home just as Dr. Morris was being summoned. For 16 hours, he paced outside their bedroom door while Mrs. Sullivan and the doctor attended to Penelope inside. Finally, in the early hours of the morning, a baby's cry pierced the silence. Minutes later, Mrs. Sullivan opened the door, her tired face wreathed in smiles. "You have a son, Marshal," she announced. "A strong, healthy boy." Ethan entered the bedroom to find Penelope propped up against pillows, her face exhausted but radiant as she cradled a small bundle in her arms. She looked up as he approached, tears of joy shining in her eyes. "Come meet your son," she whispered. Carefully, reverently, Ethan took the infant in his arms. The baby had a shock of dark hair like his father's, and when he blinked sleepily up at the new face above him, eyes that promised to be as green as his mother's. "He's perfect," Ethan said, his voice thick with emotion. "Just like his mother." They named him William after Penelope's uncle, with Daniel as his middle name in honor of Ethan's father. Young William Daniel Sawyer thrived under his parents' devoted care, growing strong and curious about the world around him. As his first birthday approached, Ethan received news that required his presence in Boise for several days. "I'll be back before his birthday," he promised Penelope as he prepared to leave. "Nothing could keep me away." 3 days into Ethan's absence, a stranger arrived in Shoshone, a well-dressed gentleman who inquired at the general store about the marshal's residence. When directed to the small house on the edge of town, he approached with measured steps, hat in hand. Penelope was in the garden, William playing on a blanket beside her, when she noticed the man at her gate. Immediately wary of unannounced visitors, a caution born of past experience, she picked up her son protectively. "May I help you?" she called, maintaining a safe distance. "Mrs. Sawyer." The man removed his hat, revealing gray-streaked hair. "My name is Judge Carlton Matthews. I'm with the Territorial Court." Penelope relaxed slightly at the mention of the court but remained cautious. "My husband is away on official business. Actually, it's you I've come to see." The judge opened the gate but went no further. "May I speak with you privately? It concerns a legal matter of some importance." Curiosity overcoming her caution, Penelope nodded. "Please come inside. I'll just put my son down for his nap first." Once William was settled in his crib, Penelope joined the judge in her parlor, offering him coffee, which he politely accepted. "Mrs. Sawyer," he began, "I've come regarding the estate of William Blackwell." Penelope tensed. "My uncle, but he had no estate." "Everything was lost when we were attacked." The judge shook his head. "Not everything, it seems. Shortly before your journey west, your uncle deposited a sum of money with a bank in St. Louis, with instructions that it be held in trust for you should anything happen to him." I had no idea," Penelope stammered, stunned by the revelation. "The bank has been attempting to locate you for over a year." Judge Matthews removed an envelope from his jacket. "When I mentioned to a colleague that I was traveling to this region, he asked me to deliver this document personally, as it contains sensitive financial information." Penelope accepted the envelope with trembling hands. Inside was a bank draft for $2,000, a fortune by frontier standards, along with legal papers confirming her identity as the sole beneficiary of William Blackwell's estate. "This is overwhelming," she said finally, looking up at the judge. "Why would my uncle not tell me about this money?" Judge Matthews smiled kindly. "In my experience, Mrs. Sawyer, men of your uncle's generation often believed in protecting women from financial concerns. Perhaps he intended it as a surprise once you were settled in Oregon." After the judge departed, Penelope sat holding the bank draft, tears flowing freely. It was not just the money, though, that would certainly secure their future, but the final connection to her uncle, the knowledge that even in death, he had found a way to care for her. When Ethan returned home 2 days later, she shared the news, watching his face as he examined the documents. "This changes everything," he said at last, looking up at her. "With this money we could build a larger house, maybe even buy more land." Penelope shook her head. "I don't want a different house. I love our home." She took his hands in hers. "But I do have an idea for the money." Together, they decided to invest half the sum in expanding the town's general store, becoming partners with the current owner. The rest they placed in a bank account for William's education and their future security. The investment proved wise as Shoshone grew. So did the store's prosperity, providing a steady income to supplement Ethan's marshal salary. By William's 5th birthday, their family had expanded to include a daughter, Elizabeth Martha Sawyer, whose arrival coincided with Ethan's promotion to chief marshal for the Idaho Territory. Though his new position required more travel, he arranged his schedule to ensure he never missed important family moments. On a warm summer evening in 1885, nearly 10 years after their first meeting, Ethan and Penelope sat on their porch swing, watching their children play in the yard. William, now 9, was teaching his 4-year-old sister how to throw a lasso using a small rope Ethan had made for him. Elizabeth's laughter rang out as she missed repeatedly, her determination matching her brother's patience. "Did you ever imagine this?" Penelope asked, leaning against her husband's shoulder. "That day at the auction block, did you ever think we'd end up here?" Ethan's arm tightened around her. "I knew I wanted to help you," he admitted, "but no, I couldn't have imagined all this happiness." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "You belonged to me from that first moment, though I didn't realize it then." Penelope smiled up at him. "And you belonged to me. It just took us some time to discover it." As twilight deepened into night, they called the children in for supper. Together, the family that had begun in such unlikely circumstances shared their meal, their conversation filled with the day's small adventures and plans for tomorrow. Later, after the children were asleep, Ethan and Penelope stood in the doorway of William's room, watching their son's peaceful slumber. In the adjacent room, Elizabeth clutched her favorite doll, her auburn curls so like her mother's spread across the pillow. "We've come a long way from that auction block," Ethan whispered, drawing Penelope close. "Yes," she agreed, her heart full, "and every step was worth it." In the quiet of their bedroom, as moonlight spilled through the curtains, they reaffirmed the bond that had begun in chaos and blossomed into enduring love. Their story of rescue, courage, and devotion had become legend in Shoshone, told and retold as an example of how love could flourish even in the wild frontier. But for Ethan and Penelope Sawyer, it wasn't legend. It was simply their life, a life built day by day, challenge by challenge, joy by joy, in the home and family they had created together. And when visitors to Shoshone asked about the distinguished marshal and his accomplished wife, old-timers would smile knowingly and begin the tale. "Well, it all started years ago, right here in the town square, when a woman was humiliated at the auction block, and our marshal stood tall and said, 'She belongs to me.'